Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Mohammed Layiq Sediqi, the father of Holophase. Part 8. Constraint Relations as Grammar. Remember the language we are learning. There is one field, phi, the holophase, one continuous cyclic movement from which all of reality unfolds. When phi begins to change, its first derivatives appear, and with them, the three dimensions show themselves at once. Time as omega, space as k, and motion as v, built from both. Every higher derivative is a finer question about how phi changes, and each one casts three shadows together: a time shadow, a space shadow, and a motion shadow. These echoes mix and weave into one another, forming the patterns we call fields, particles, bodies, thoughts, and worlds. In this picture, everything that exists is a living tapestry of phi, endlessly echoing through its derivatives and their dimensional shadows. Today, we listen to just one of those echoes. We are in Episode 8, the pure abstract language. In the earlier parts, we understood that phi lives on a circle, that only differences in phi carry meaning, that derivatives are the letters of the language, that they organize into a hierarchy, and that at each point in reality, we can collect all of those letters into a complete local dictionary, J infinity phi. That dictionary tells us every allowed way phi can change, right there, in principle to infinite detail. But a dictionary alone does not make a living language. You can have every word ever written, but if you simply throw them together at random, blue thunder dream jumps quietly, yesterday sky turned piano, you feel at once that something is wrong. The words are real, but the sentence is not. What is missing is structure. What is missing is grammar. Today we step into the third layer of the pure abstract language, syntax. In holophase language, syntax appears as constraint relations between derivatives. They are the abstract grammar of phi. This is book 8.3, Abstract Syntax. And part 8 is our first step into it, constraint relations as grammar. 1. From dictionary to grammar. Think again of a small child learning to speak. At first, they collect words. Mama, water, ball, no. These words are like isolated derivatives. Each one points to something, each one has power, but by itself, each word can only carry a fragment of meaning. Then something miraculous happens. The child does not just shout, Mama, ball, up. They begin to link words together with invisible rules. Mama up, ball go, I want water. They are discovering grammar, the hidden structure that decides which combinations of words are allowed and which are broken. In the holophase language, we have already passed the stage of collecting words. Our dictionary at a point includes omega, k, d phi, v, alpha, curvature, divergence, mixed derivatives, and an infinite tower of higher and higher derivatives. Each of these is a pure symbol that answers a different change question about phi. But if those symbols were completely independent, if you could assign arbitrary values to each derivative with no relation between them, the picture would break. The field would not be coherent. It would be like a pile of syllables that never quite form a language. Constraint relations are what prevent that breakdown. They are the rules that say, if phi behaves like this in time, then its behavior in space cannot be completely arbitrary. Or, if the slopes are arranged like this, then the curvature must fall within these patterns. They are the consistency rules that glue the dictionary into a language. You can imagine an extreme version of this. Think of somebody speaking where each word is chosen by rolling a dice. The words themselves are valid, they all belong to the language, but the sentence that comes out is nonsense. In exactly the same way, you could imagine choosing random values for all derivatives in J infinity phi. Almost every such random choice would correspond to no real field at all. It would be a fake dictionary that can never be realized as a pattern in the world. Constraint relations slice through that chaos and pick out the thin, delicate set of possibilities that correspond to genuine, coherent fields. What constraint relations are asking? At the deepest level, every constraint relation is asking a single question of phi. How must your changes fit together if you are to remain a single continuous field? Let us ground that with a simple picture. Imagine once again a smooth hillside. You can stand in one place and say, the slope here is 10 degrees. That is like a first derivative, a simple change. You can also say, the slope is getting steeper as I walk forward, which is like a second derivative, change of change. Now, suppose someone tells you two things at once. At this point, the slope is very steep, and at this point, the curvature is exactly zero. That would describe a perfectly straight ramp, not a hill that bends. If they then add, also, if you walk just a little to the left, the slope suddenly flips direction with no transition, the story becomes impossible. Those numbers for slope and curvature and their neighbors simply cannot fit together into a smooth hill. They violate the constraint relations that any smooth surface must satisfy. Phi is like the hillside, but in a much richer space. It lives on a circle of values, spreads across time and space, and has an infinite cascade of derivatives. Constraint relations tell us which combinations of all these derivatives can actually come from a single underlying phi, and which combinations are fakes, random numbers wearing the mask of a field. You can also think of constraint relations as promises that phi makes to itself. When phi varies in one direction, it implicitly promises to vary in compatible ways in other directions, so that the whole pattern remains continuous. If those promises are broken, the picture tears. You get cracks, jumps, or contradictions. The grammar of constraint relations is the list of promises that a smooth, unified phi must keep. 3. A simple example of grammar. Order of questions. One of the simplest and most beautiful constraint relations is the one I hinted at earlier. The order of questioning should not matter. Imagine you are allowed to ask phi two small questions. First, how do you change if I move a tiny bit forward in time? Second, how do you change if I move a tiny bit to the right in space? If you ask time, then space, you are effectively taking a time derivative and then a space derivative. If you ask space, then time, you are doing the opposite. For a smooth phi, the result must be the same. The tiny rectangle you move around in space-time should not care about which side you walk first. Mathematically, that becomes the statement. Dou squared theta by dou t dou x equals dou squared phi by dou x dou t. This is a constraint relation. It is a grammatical rule written in derivative form. It says, in order for phi to be a well-behaved field, the mixed second derivatives must commute. You are not free to choose them independently. They are chained to each other by smoothness. You do not need to follow the symbols to feel the meaning. It is the same as saying, if I walk east, then north, and you walk north, then east, and we both take the same size steps, we should meet in the same corner of the square. If we do not meet, if our paths end in different places, something strange has happened to the geometry. The space is no longer ordinary. In the same way, if the mixed derivatives disagree, the geometry of phi's change has become exotic or inconsistent. This one rule already ripples across all three echoes. In the time echo, it means that the way a spatial pattern evolves over time must be consistent from moment to moment. You cannot have a pattern that seems to flow smoothly when watched at one angle in spacetime, but breaks apart when watched at another. In the space echo, it means that if a temporal rhythm spreads out in space, its phase must match up as you move around, so that waves do not suddenly jump out of step without warning. In the motion echo, it ensures that the velocities and accelerations implied by phi do not create impossible twists or tears, like a river that somehow flows both uphill and downhill in the same place with no explanation. When this rule holds, we can trust that phi is telling a coherent story in both time and space. When it fails, something deeper is broken. 4. Constraint relations in the master tree. Return now to the master tree picture. At each point in reality, the trunk is phi. From that trunk spring branches. First derivatives, second derivatives, third derivatives, all the way up. In our earlier parts, we looked primarily at the branches themselves, what each derivative means, how the orders line up, how the tree grows. Constraint relations live in the spaces between branches. They are like invisible ropes tying one branch to another, or like lines of tension that keep the whole crown in balance. For example, a relation may connect the time derivative branch dou phi var dou t to the space derivative branch dou phi var dou x, saying they cannot bend independently. Another relation may link the curvature branch to the gradient branch, or link certain fourth-order derivatives to combinations of second-order ones. You cannot point to a single twig and say, this twig is grammar. Grammar is in the pattern of how the twigs are allowed to arrange themselves. It is in the fact that some configurations of the tree are possible and others are forbidden. If you have ever pruned a tree, you know this intuitively. You cannot simply bend any branch in any direction and expect the tree to survive. The internal tensions, the weight distribution, and the connections within the wood all constrain what shapes are possible. Constraint relations are like the mathematics of those internal tensions inside the abstract tree of derivatives. 5. Grammar as limits on freedom. It might sound restrictive to talk about constraints. We often think of freedom as the ability to do anything. But in language, we know the opposite is true. Pure randomness is not freedom, it is noise. Real freedom is the ability to say meaningful things. Constraint relations in phi have the same flavor. They limit the ways phi can vary, but in doing so, they make meaning possible. Without constraints, phi could assign unrelated values and derivatives everywhere, with no pattern that could be recognized as a wave, a particle, a structure, or a life form. With constraints, phi's variations become readable. Imagine jazz improvisation. A skilled musician is free to play almost anything, but not literally anything. They respect the key, the rhythm, and the harmonic structure. These musical constraints are what let the improvisation sound like music instead of noise. Phi's constraint relations are the key, rhythm, and harmony of the universal field. You can see this even in very simple games. Take chess. The pieces are few and the board is small, but the rules tightly constrain what counts as a legal move. Those constraints are exactly what make deep strategy possible. If the pieces could move however they liked, the game would collapse into chaos in a few turns. Constraint is not the enemy of richness, it is its foundation. 6. How constraint relations touch J infinity phi. In the previous part, we met J infinity phi, the complete dictionary of all derivatives at a point. You can think of J infinity phi as a giant stack of pages. On each page, a different derivative, in every direction, to every order, listed with its value. Constraint relations run through that stack like red threads. They say, you cannot choose these numbers independently. If the value on this page is such and such, then the value on that page must lie within this band. And this other page must equal that particular combination of the earlier ones. If J infinity phi were truly arbitrary, with no constraints, then almost no choice of numbers would correspond to any phi at all. It would be like picking a random sequence of symbols and hoping it turns into a meaningful book. Constraint relations carve out a thin, structured subspace of possibilities inside the enormous space of all formal dictionaries. Only within that subspace do we find valid fields. You can picture this as a huge library where most of the possible books are just gibberish strings of letters. Grammar and meaning restrict us to a tiny subset of books that actually say something. In the same way, constraint relations restrict us to those J infinity phi that genuinely come from a smooth, coherent phi. There is another way to see it that is helpful. Think of J infinity phi as a musical score for a very complicated instrument. Each derivative is like a note or a chord on some staff. Constraint relations are like the rules of harmony and rhythm that say, if this note appears here with this timing, then that note must follow in such and such a way, or the result will clash. The full score at a point only really plays if those harmonic relations are respected. 7. Stability and falsifiability of grammar. One of the strengths of treating constraints as grammar is that it makes them testable in a very concrete way. Imagine an ideal experimentalist of the future, with an extremely sensitive device that can sample phi and many of its derivatives in a tiny region. They scan a patch of reality, perhaps a plasma near a star or a quantum fluid in a lab, and reconstruct an approximate J-infinity phi from their data. Then they check the known constraint relations. Do the mixed derivatives commute? Do the geometric identities hold? Do the connections between different orders match the smoothness assumptions? If the answer is yes, repeatedly, across different contexts, then the grammar we have written down is empirically supported. Our abstract book 8.3 is not just a fantasy. It is mirrored in the way reality actually speaks. If the answer is no, in a controlled and reproducible way, something profound has happened. We have found a context where phi speech does not follow the grammar we expected. Perhaps the field is not differentiable in the way we assumed. Perhaps new kinds of constraints apply at extreme scales. Perhaps we have reached a domain where the Holophase language must be extended. This is how grammar in Holophase remains honest, by always pointing towards potential experiments and observations that could, in principle, prove it wrong. It is not a mystical set of rules imposed from outside. It is a hypothesis about how reality organizes its own patterns, a hypothesis that must face data. 8. Examples of constraint-like grammar in everyday life. Although constraint relations for phi are abstract and mathematical, the idea of grammar governing patterns appears constantly in everyday life. In fluid flow, the continuity equation acts like a constraint. The way fluid density changes in time and the way it flows in space must fit a specific relation. You cannot specify them independently if you want a real fluid, just as you cannot choose words independently if you want a real sentence. In electricity and magnetism, Maxwell's equations relate electric fields, magnetic fields, and their time and space derivatives. They do not just tell you there is a field here and a field there. They insist that these fields satisfy tight, coupled relations, a kind of multi-field grammar that prevents impossible configurations. In biology, the genetic code is constrained. Not every sequence of nucleotides produces a viable protein. There are grammar rules written in the chemistry of life that make some sequences meaningful and others deadly or silent. The pairing rules of DNA and the way triplets code for amino acids are like constraint relations on the alphabet of nucleotides. In conversation, you constantly feel constraint relations. If someone tells a story and suddenly contradicts an earlier part, you notice the violation instantly. Your mind has an internal grammar for narrative coherence. Cause should precede effect. Characters should act in roughly consistent ways, and so on. Without these constraints, you would not be able to follow the story. You can even notice constraint relations inside yourself. Your physical sensations, emotions, and thoughts are not random. They tend to line up in patterns. Chronic stress, for example, may impose its own internal grammar. Certain thoughts trigger certain bodily reactions, which trigger certain feelings. Recognizing these patterns is part of healing, part of rewriting the internal grammar of your own life. 9. Listening for grammar. As you move through the world, you can train yourself to listen for grammar, not only in speech, but in structure and motion. When you watch waves on the surface of water, notice how their spacing, speed, and height are not independent. They obey specific dispersion relations imposed by the depth of the water and gravity. This is grammar at work, mediating what kinds of wave sentences the ocean is allowed to speak. When you hear music, notice how the timing of notes and the pitch relationships follow rules of rhythm and harmony. Even highly experimental music still relies on constraints to be experienced as music at all. If all timing and tuning are abandoned entirely, our ears quickly lose any sense of direction. The piece becomes more like noise, a kind of semantic breakdown. When you see a building standing, You are witnessing constraint relations in action between forces, materials, and geometry. If those relations are violated, the building collapses, the sentence of architecture fails. Engineers do not simply choose beam sizes and shapes at random. They respect equations that constrain how stress and strain must balance. Thinking in holophase terms, you can imagine that underlying all of these is some version of phi must change like this, not like that, which is exactly what a constraint relation says. The world is full of examples once you know how to look for them. X. Returning to the holophase language as a whole. Before we close, let us zoom out and remind ourselves of the larger journey of the holophase language. At the deepest level, the language is built from one field, phi, and all its derivatives. When phi differentiates for the first time, time, space, and motion appear as omega, k, and v, three echoes of the same underlying change. Above them, every higher derivative is a finer question about how phi changes. And every such question casts three shadows at once: a time echo, a space echo, and the motion echo. These echoes combine into the master tree of phi's derivatives. In episode 8, we are looking at this whole structure in its pure abstract form, before we commit to any particular physical implementation. In parts 1 to 4, we understood the stage: phi as a function to a circle, with shift symmetry and cyclic value space. In parts 5 to 7, we met the abstract alphabet and the complete local dictionary, J infinity phi, that collects all derivatives at a point. Now, in part 8, we have added a new layer: grammar. Constraint relations tell us which dictionaries are allowed and which are impossible, which combinations of derivatives are coherent, and which would tear the field apart. They are the silent rules that keep the language of phi intelligible. From the perspective of the master tree, we have climbed from the root value along the branches of the derivative hierarchy, and now we have begun to study the invisible connections between branches, the way the whole crown hangs together without tearing itself apart. We can see how far into the holophase master tree of language we have already climbed, and how the view keeps widening with each step. We started at the trunk, where phi is just a pure potential on a circle, and now we are standing among high branches, watching how every derivative, every echo in time, space, and motion is tied to the others by hidden lines of consistency. In the wider holophase journey, this is also a reminder of the overall picture. The holophase language is not just a list of symbols. It is an organized system that stretches from the simple to the infinitely subtle. It begins with a single cyclic field, blossoms into a tree of derivatives, gathers into a local dictionary J infinity phi, and is held together by constraint relations that act as grammar. Step by step, we are learning to see reality as a single, coherent language of phase and its derivatives. And we are slowly climbing its master tree to understand how far we have traveled into its branches. In the next part of our journey, we will move from pure grammar towards solutions of the grammar, the allowed sentences that phi can actually speak. These will appear as abstract equations and patterns that later become the laws of motion, waves, and fields when the language is implemented in a real universe. 11. A simple inner exercise. Before we close, let me offer you a small, gentle exercise you can play with after this audio finishes, wherever you are. It is a way to feel constraint relations not as abstract equations, but as something almost tangible in your own experience. First, pick something around you that is changing slowly. It could be the traffic outside your window, the pattern of clouds in the sky, the rise and fall of your own breathing, or even the shifting background sounds in the room. For a few moments, just notice the pattern itself. This is like noticing phi. Next, ask a first derivative question. How is this changing right now? Is the traffic getting denser or lighter? Are the clouds thickening or dispersing? Is your breathing deepening or becoming shallower? This is like paying attention to omega or k, the first letters in the alphabet of change. Then ask a second derivative question. Is that change itself changing? Is the traffic jam building faster or beginning to ease? Are the clouds clearing more and more quickly or slowing down? Is your breath becoming calmer at an increasing rate, or are you starting to tense again? This is like listening for alpha or curvature, the nuance letters. Now, quietly imagine that these answers cannot be arbitrary. Imagine that your breathing pattern, the sounds, the movement of people and cars, all have to fit certain invisible rules so that the scene stays coherent. You may not know the equations, but you can feel that the pattern has a style, a structure, a way it tends to behave. That felt sense of this fits, this does not fit, is your intuitive contact with grammar, with constraint relations. If you repeat this exercise in different places, in a quiet park, in a busy market, in your own kitchen, you will start to sense that every situation has its own small dialect of constraints, its own way in which changes are allowed or disallowed. In the Holophase picture, all of these are local accents of the one deeper grammar written into phi and its derivatives. May your listening deepen as the language of phi unfolds within. Salam and peace be upon you.